Hi everyone. My name is Tom Angel. I had the Civil Rights Era Activism as my topic for our Native American history course, and here's my lesson. So this is our agenda. These are the three books that I read for my topic, and then our one common reading, the Our History is the Future. We're going to go over a brief overview and what the objectives of this lesson are going to be. We're going to explore Vine Deloria's classic manifesto, Custer Died for Your Sins. We're going to explore and talk about Native American activism in the Cold War with Daniel M. Cobb, and then talking about the rise of the National Indian Youth Coordination Movement in Red Power Rising by Bradley Shreve, and then just kind of bring it all together, see what these books have in common, what they have as differences, and overall what Native American activism during the Cold War period, what that looked like. So just like I'd like to always do with my students, and we're going to start with our objectives. So we've got three objectives here. What classmates will be able to do by the following. We're going to refer back to these at the end, kind of see how well, check our understanding. How did we do with these sorts of images, or with these questions? There'll be images throughout. I'm kind of mainly focusing on the information in this more lecture format. But here are our three objectives. A goal to demonstrate an understanding of the variation and nuance that exists within Native American activism, kind of getting at like how American activism during the Cold War era, there um, wasn't this monolithic type of activism. There was lots of variation. Recognizing the link between quest for Native American sovereignty and Cold War policy. And then we're going to explain the varying approaches and perspectives of the authors and how it applies to the overall historiography. All right, so we're going to start with Vine Deloria Jr., Custer Died for Your Sins. So this is a classic in the field. It's a cornerstone. It inspired many other works, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit more later. It's a manifesto for Native Americans during the Cold War era. Estes writes that the 1969 classic Custer Died for Your Sins set aflame a generation of young indigenous activists. He writes that in his book, which I have right here, Our History is the Future, Our Common Reading. One of the things I found most interesting about this book is that it does read like a primary source, and that much of the writing done by Cobb and Shreve wouldn't have been possible without the work of Vine Deloria Jr. He's a renowned scholar of and Native American activist, and his writings were incredibly influential. It not only gave a path forward, but it provided wit and perspective to what the outside on what the Native experience was like. I think that in many ways, Deloria, um, really provides a clear understanding of what Native American activism should look like and how it kind of took form. I'm gonna go through this pretty much chapter by chapter and just kind of talk about some of the common themes that I noticed as I was reading this book. Starting with the first chapter, how the central message are that Indians are still alive. They have certain dreams, and yet they're still unfortunately being overrun. He explains various tribes. He goes into a lot of the history of different tribes and their variations, and really starting out with the foundation that there's not this monolithic culture that existed. He goes into detail, and this is a recurring theme throughout not just this book, but the other two, about the rivalry between the NCAI and the NIYC, and how they had different ways of showing their activism and different methods for how they would try to achieve their ends. He talks about he reminds us about the exploitive nature of resource extraction on Indian land, and how a lot of times settlers and white Americans believed that they could use the land better than Native Americans could. There's a quote here from page 27. The primary goal and need of Indians today is not for someone to feel sorry for us. We need a new policy by Congress acknowledging our right to live in peace. So very much starting his book, introduction, in the first chapter here by saying what the goal is, right? The goal should be, we don't want you to feel bad for us. And he goes into a lot of the cultural ethnicities about how people, they somehow people started to, they happened to discover their Native American roots and Pocahontas and all these, female Native Americans being this like pseudo royalty that white Europeans like to look at. He gets into that, but he also gets into like, don't feel sorry for us. We just want to live in peace. And he kind of touches upon that theme throughout. Chapter two goes into the laws and treaties. I use this historical caricature of the Cherokee Nation in my classroom to talk about the dismembering of the tribes by different various special interest groups and white settlers. I felt like it was a fitting image for this slide. He goes in depth in this chapter about, and this is where we first get into our touching of Cold War policy, about Nixon and LBJ keeping their commitments in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, right? Another connection to Estes is how could the United States defend its claims to moral superiority when Native peoples were not free and remain in an impoverished state? So connecting to the Cold War ideologies about how the United States wanted to have the superior economic model, um, the superior not only just economic model but political model, right? They believed they were a force for good, and the USSR was the evil empire, so to speak. But you still had, Native people in an impoverished state and treaties being violated left and right. He does a really good job of explaining trusteeship and what that meant and why trusteeship was a policy that they were trying to fight against, and how many of the he gives a lot of historical background here with early colonists and how we were, trying to be like Native Americans were the friends of early colonists. I mean, you go back all the way to the first Thanksgiving and those sorts of, historical origin stories, and ultimately how Native Americans helped the colonists during the War for Independence, and various examples he highlights throughout this chapter. And that, once they were able to get their own, the white settlers were able to have an incredible amount of power. They used it against Native Americans. It says here on page 35, I'm going to just read a quick excerpt because I think that's going to be helpful. When Indian people remember how weak and helpless the United States once was, how much it needed the good graces of the tribes for its very existence, how the tribes shepherded the ignorant colonists through drought and blizzard, kept them alive, helped them grow, they burn with resentment at the treatment they have received from the United States government. It's as if a man had invited a helpless person to his home, fed and clothed him until he was strong and able to care for himself, only to have the person he had nursed wreak incredible havoc on the entire household. All this destruction in the name of help. It is too much to bear. I mean, I think that's really powerful. Personally, I think he throughout the book provides these conjectures and these anecdotes to create an overall point. And I mean, his writing is incredibly witty and sarcastic and biting, but through that he cuts to an essential truth consistently. And I think this chapter is just one of many examples about that. And then on 53, he's talking about how the only way forward is cultural and economic imperialism must be relinquished. So that's kind of a synopsis of this chapter, giving some historical background for sure. Chapter three really gets into the issue of termination, which was a big policy for that existed under Eisenhower, and can be related to Cold War policy, right? With this whole idea of decolonialization, and modernization. The United States government decided the Indian problem has been solved. We do not need to take care of the Native Americans anymore. The reservations can be, they've lost their independent jurisdiction and they can be governed by civil authority. And it's a modern way, in Delory's view, is a modern way the Indian Wars were continued. It relates to Cold War policy because it very much connects to this global idea of decolonization, and the United States, under the guise of helping the Indians, really was saying that, you don't need to be our responsibility anymore. You have all this, look at all this freedom. But really what it did, it opened up land to more settlement. And there was a really great example in this chapter of the Menominee, apologies if I'm pronouncing this wrong, uh, Menominee, Menominee tribe, apologies, and how they were a race due to termination. He muses on if the United States is a sick society with the death of King and the Kennedys. And ultimately, this would be a flashpoint for Native Americans in terms of some Native Americans agreeing and some Native Americans disagreeing with this, and getting into that idea that, like, no, activism and opinions, they're not monolithic, and there's a lot of nuance and variety. Is going to be kind of a common occurrence. Chapter 4 and 5 is really interesting because this is where Deloria really gets into people who are there to help the tribe or study the tribe, and the harm that they actually do to the tribes, right? And it's interesting because he the chapter 4 anthropologists and other friends really should have air quotes around it. He uses chapter 4 to lambaste the fake allies and academics and their problematic study of their foreign culture, right? And how a lot of times these anthropologists will come and, study the Native Americans, and then it ends up just justifying various policy positions that end up coming back to hurt them, such as termination, right? And for instance, and an anthropologist goes to a reservation and they say, wow, this reservation is really impoverished. Maybe we shouldn't have a reservation anymore, right? Without actually asking, the people who live on that reservation, what do they need, right? It's just they're different, their different observations, right? And the termination policy, I'm going to go back to that for a second. The termination policy is kind of the start of, you know, the difference between, and I'll get into this more later, the difference between the civil rights movement and the Native American activist movement. Whereas, like, the civil rights movement was African Americans trying to join white society and become one with white society and achieve this middle class values. Whereas in a lot of ways, we see with termination, right? A lot of Native Americans, they didn't want to be assimilated. They didn't want acculturation. They didn't want to achieve status within white society. They just wanted to be left alone, but they also being left alone, they also still needed and wanted that support. So it's kind of this like push pull of like we need support, we need economic assistance, we need tools to develop our own society, but we also like don't want to be part of society. And that ends up getting into a lot of the tension within different Native American groups, and something I'll explore a little bit more later. So detour, but back to chapter 4 and 5. In many ways, Native Americans are biculture in nature. They felt like sometimes anthropologists, they'd have their own problems. They're mansplained back to them. Mansplained, I guess, is probably the best way to describe it. And Deloria does a really good job in chapter 5 of highlighting religion and how religion historically was undefined as a sphere of influence, and giving the historical background for why missionaries were so problematic, and how oftentimes they would bring in the Christian religion but discount a lot of the Native American traditions that had been built up over centuries and centuries. He asked the essential question, right? Will missionaries continue to be a burden? And lastly, I mean, Deloria himself is Episcopalian and is Christian, which is different than Estes. Estes is very much against Christianity, at least from the outset, in terms of a lot of what he argues for. He kind of talks about the violent inherent nature of Christianity and it being a settler religion, whereas the Laurie is kind of more on the inside, saying that coming to the ultimate conclusion that an Indian version of Christianity could do much for our society. And I think that that's really interesting, right? And you can kind of see that in a lot of different places in the world, where Christianity it adopts a lot of the local customs and traditions and ends up being a force for good. Obviously, there's extreme examples on the other side where it's done more harm than good and has advocated violence and things like that. So it's not an they're both sides for sure. But his opinion is that there could be a version of Christianity that could do much for society, but ultimately it's failing in that endeavor. in the present moment. Remember, book was also written and published originally in 1969, so the world in which he's writing is very different. But I was really struck throughout reading it, all of the connections. Like if you didn't realize it was from 1969, reading it, you might be surprised when you find that out. He does mention Vietnam a lot, which kind of gives that away, but ultimately it doesn't read like it's from, you know, almost, 50 years ago or whatnot. Chapter 6 is primarily about government agencies, which I think, is extremely interesting. Very much a repeated theme that Indians are outside of the left versus right dichotomy, but they still need social services, kind of as I was mentioning earlier. So yes, they don't really want to weigh in. They're not like, oh, we're liberals, or oh, we're conservatives, or oh, we're going to be Republicans, or no, we're Democrats. And a lot of times some of the more progressive members of specifically the NIYC tended to skew Democrat, but not as much, not always. We'll get into that in a little bit. Um, so one of the core arguments and rivalries within this chapter that he talks about, that kind of serves as a flashpoint for inter tribal affairs, is that some wanted to get rid of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where some wanted to increase and reform it. So there were plenty of examples of inept leadership provided. I think the Bureau of Indian Affairs really comes away with, from all three of my readings, not looking great. And they're very bureaucratic, very much like, we'll go in, we want to listen to you, we want to listen to you, but continues to fail to read the room. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, he often just failed to read the room. They'd say, here are the things we need. We need you to listen to us. Here's the bill that we want passed. And he would just take it and do exactly the opposite. I think I gotta read on 128. This is a good section. So he talks about Deloria in his classic sarcastic way. He talks a lot about the different field offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and how different states have different reputations in terms of how, you know, like willing the bureau, the field offices to help, and how responsive are they? That's the word I was looking for. And what's the response time? Are they going to be a helpful agency to deal with? He talks about the Juneau office is fairly responsive to tribal needs, probably the best reputation for service to Native peoples of any of these area offices. That's from 129. Classic Deloria here on 128. He says Sacramento area office covers the entire state of California. For decades, people have been trying to figure out if it has any relationship to Indians living in that state. Finally, someone decided it was placed there to hide information from the Indians, which they might otherwise ferret out from other agencies. In recent years, this area office has begun to do something for Indians after a long siesta. Then he muses, whether it will manage to get a program off the ground before California is dumped in the sea by an earthquake is a matter of serious speculation by Indians of the state. I thought that was funny. There were definitely times, and I think this book was incredibly entertaining. That was one point where I definitely laughed out loud reading it. And then he does what I think is really helpful, is that Deloria doesn't just like, complain and moan about all these different problems that are facing Native America. He actually gives concrete examples, and this chapter does a great job of doing that. In the form of four solutions: discretionary funds, tribal employment, which resembles like a civil service type organization, a reorganization of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And talking about that for a second. So there existed a very fundamental disagreement between activists on, do we get rid of the BIA or do we reorganize it? Deloria was on the side of reorganizing it, and he felt as though we still need social services. We can't just get rid of it, because then there's a vacuum and nothing's there to replace it. There were people who were more progressive, people from the NIYC, who would have just gotten rid of it full wholesale. But he decided, and Deloria felt it was in their best interest to reorganize it. And then lastly, the disposition of federal responsibility to Indians. So with that last point, he wanted more Indian representation within um, federal federal responsibilities and like they didn't have enough representation within, federal agencies and saying here that he also wanted them to be continue to be eligible for grants from all federal agencies as long as the tribe remained functional. So even though like he wants the representation, he wants reorganization of the BIA. He does advocate for some amount of separation, but recognizing they still need to be supported by the government. Just like the government funds universities, just like the government provides communities with grants, he felt as though we're living in this country, we still should be provided that same privilege. Um, Chapter 7, probably my favorite chapter out of any of the books I've read. It's, definitely the most lighthearted. I think it came at a great part in the book. He provides a lot of the background. He provides a lot of the solutions, and then he kind of takes this midpoint in the book to just kind of a one-off sort of chapter, chance for brevity, an explanation Indians can laugh to. Ultimately, what it did is it served to illustrate the point that Native Americans, they can laugh too. They've got a culture here that's not just like this downtrodden, depressing, always the victim type culture. There's, lots to laugh at as well. So many great anecdotes in this chapter. The quote here from 146, always been a great disappointment to Indian people that the humorous side of Indian life has not been mentioned by professed experts. We have a comic here about, border control and Native Americans as well. Um, Oh, this one's good. I'm gonna quickly read a anecdote if you don't mind. That was funny. Um so there was this old man, right? He had three sons, Deerfoot, Running Bear, and Falling Rocks. And the old man of the tribe said that the his three sons shouldn't cede any land over to white settlers unless all three of them signed. Scouts, they quickly found Deerfoot and Running Bear and convinced them they should sign the treaty to cede over their land, but they were unable to find Falling Rocks. Years and years went by in Arizona, and everyone in the treaty sought the missing band so that the treaty could be concluded. But the last son, this guy, Falling Rocks, he wasn't anywhere to be found. Eventually, everyone gave up, except the state highway department. They continued looking for him, and that is why today, as you drive through the mountain pass, all the mountain passes in Arizona, you will see large signs that read, "Look out for falling rocks." Um, I mean, just classic, right? There's just so much in this chapter. I could probably spend 20 minutes just reading anecdotes from this chapter and enjoying myself. I'm not going to do that, but just one small example of the wit that he uses to honestly convey a larger message about, Indian culture and, the good-natured side of it for sure. Chapter 8. So this, gets kind of back in the saddle with the more um serious modes of activism. This chapter is really, really important about the red and the black. And he talks about how he is fundamentally opposed to many of the attributes of the civil rights movement, right? He's often critical in this chapter of Martin Luther King Jr. in a way that surprised me personally and that I found myself not always agreeing with. I think he gives a prescription for how blacks should be activists without acknowledging the unique historical background in enough detail and that he should. So, for instance, he talks about, right, how blacks are striving to become one with whites, even though they were mistreated, and they want assimilation when really they should just want independence, right? And that's easy to say from his perspective, right? But I don't think he explores the idea of what slavery did to their culture in as much detail as he could. Now, obviously, Delory is an incredibly smart man. He taught at the college level. I'm not necessarily saying he's not aware of these things, but it wasn't as included in the chapter as I think it could have been. There was an exploration of historical white culture, or lack thereof. He talks about white culture being really just like the absence of culture and white culture being a destruction of other cultures. He writes on 176, Western man still smashes that which he does not understand. He also uses this chapter to critique the Poor People's Campaign, which is going to be a common theme that the other books talk about as well. Um, and he aligns with the explanation put forth by Cobb about the omnibus bill to the tribes in spring of 1996. Udall, like I said there would be collaboration, but there was not. So there was this bill about, you know, that was going to support indigenous rights. And the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, had gone in depth saying, we're going to listen to you, we're going to take your feedback, you're our trusted allies in this. And then they drafted the bill without consulting any of the tribes. And there was significant backlash for that. It says in here, in May of 1966, an embryo bill was conceived within the Interior, which purported to solve existing Indian problems. Um, However, in July of 1966, the National Congress of American Indians obtained a copy of this bill, um, and it wouldn't even be on the drawing boards until after the regional meetings to gather tribal opinion. So they didn't even ask. He presented a facade of consultation while he rammed it down the Indian's throat later that year. And it eventually the bill failed. So it really showed the power of native activism because the bill failed. And if he had consulted the tribes, it probably would have fared better. Um, all right, so kind of summing up the rest of the book here with chapters 9, 10, and 11. Chapter 9 was interesting because it highlighted many of the issues of Native American remembering and representation. It talks about Jim Thorpe, Tonto, Will Rogers. Jim Thorpe, who was a graduate of Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and many white Americans kind of like put up on a pedestal, like, see, we've brought assimilation. Look at this model person here. Tonto obviously being a fictional character. It talks about the tribal structure itself and chairmanship within the tribes. And really, Deloria is self-critical um, about the various issues that are within a tribe. And he talks about it being like a Tower of Babel comparison, saying none of these tribes, like even within one single tribe, there's always turnover for a lot of tribes, or other tribes, there's always one strong man, but there's a lot of disagreement with best ways to support the tribe. Um, he criticized militancy a lot, and he has unique uh, some tacit support for the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And then chapter 11 really is more or less an epilogue. Awakening of the tribes is just the beginning, and tribalism being a major key point as renewal and reflection serve as his final point. I think ultimately he comes back to his thesis at the end, saying like, look, we have to pick our spots, right? And you're going to see as I go forth here how that's different than um, the methods of the NIYC, but really saying, we got to pick our spots to be able to renew and reflect. And, we need to be authentic. We don't want to fall into the traps of just being another civil rights movement because we're not. We're different. We want different things than African Americans want. We want to be left alone. We want to be treated with respect. We want the white man to honor his previous commitments, not make new commitments and new laws. We don't need new laws. We need them to honor the previous laws. I'm just gonna read the last chapter paragraph here before I get into the next book because I think his ending is really strong in terms of like, you know, his message is very concise at the end and it's very clear. It says, but hopefully enough Indian people will take the time to reflect on their situation, on the things going on around them, both in the cities and on the reservations. And he talks a lot about the urban Indians being more refined, but reservation Indians being looked down upon when they shouldn't be. And will choose the proper points of leverage by which Indian renewal can be fully realized. That's a really, concise way of saying let's make sure we pick our spots and let's make sure we're reflective And we renew our culture, we renew our way of life. So that's kind of the vibe. Um, that's the first book. Two more to go. Appreciate you bearing with me. Kind of checking in on our, sorry, I'm going back and forth here. Checking in on our objectives here. We've seen a little bit of the nuance that exists within Native American activism. We talked a little bit more about the Native American sovereignty and the Cold War policy with the, recognizing commitments in Vietnam, but not honoring commitments here within the United States towards indigenous tribes, and then the varying approaches and perspectives. We just scratched the surface with that. So we're going to get into our next, let me fix my screen here. We're going to get into our next book, which is Native Activism in the Cold War America. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a second, give you a chance to look at it. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. All right. So this one is Daniel Cobb's Native Activism in Cold War America. Out of the three books, I definitely found this one to be the most challenging. I thought it was pretty dense. A great read for sure. Just definitely the writing style probably was a little bit more dense than the other two. He outlines the logistics that went into the Native American activism during the Cold War. This one is the most explicitly Cold War. I mean, as you can see with the title. He definitely gets into the disagreement with between the NCAI, National Congress of American Indians, and the National Indian Youth Council, and the differences that existed, right? He takes more of like the wholesale view of indigenous policy and activism. And his goal, his primary focus was to shift the 1960s. I got that. I think I got that back. Let me see. Goal is to shift the 1960s activism back. I got that right. The goal is to shift the 1960s activism back to the 1970s where it belongs and to correct the historiography, right? So a lot of people just kind of assumed that it's like, oh, we're gonna lump it into the 60s, right? With, Alcatraz and many of the different actions. The occupation of the BIA office, a lot of that happened in the 1970s. And he kind of goes on there, and he's not nearly as critical as Deloria on the civil rights movement. He's taking more of a wholesale view from the top, less of an activist point of view. Whereas this is written in the 2000s, so it has that perspective and it has that, you know, kind of from afar type way here. I really liked his introduction. He actually meets with Deloria, and he defines culture as the space of signifying practice, the semantic ground in which human beings seek to construct and represent themselves. He does a lot to decouple the Red Power movement from the American Indian movement. And that's something that both he and Shreve have in common, and they both do that. And he talks about small a activism as well in his introduction. This is probably the chapter one parallels that really explores Native American activism in a Cold War context, right? And so what I mean by that is he talks about the moral superiority that is similar to Deloria. He parallels actions happening in the Cold War and happening in the United States as it relates to decolonizations. He refers to tribal nations as America's colonies, and then he also goes into detail about the termination policy as well. So a lot of repeated themes, but coming at it from a little bit of a different lens, less like I'm someone who's affected, my people are the ones being effective, I'm an activist, here's what we can do to change it, and more just like outlining the struggle holistically. He obviously gives some commentary, right? He obviously like he doesn't agree with the termination policy, but he's not going to come out and say it, and he's not going to come out and give alternatives. He does a lot, and one part of why this made this a more difficult book, um, he does a lot to outline the logistics of activism, a lot of the politicking behind the scenes, which at times was interesting, at times was a bit dense, but it was important nonetheless. Um, Chapter 2, Declarations. This was the NCAI adopted the bold theme, self-determination, not termination. This is where he's starting to explore the different rivalries that existed and really came to a head during the Chicago conference. He introduces Clyde Warrior, who emerged as a youth leader. The Declaration of Indian Purpose, which was eventually brought to Kennedy, was significantly revised to the point where Darcy McNichol, who was a flathead activist, was like didn't even want to go to the White House to bring it to Kennedy. Earl Boyd Pierce was a character that was brought up who in this chapter who was like ultra conservative and was very much a pain in the neck of people who were trying to get this passed. But they were also it was a difficult time because they're under the threat of communism. It was right during the Bay of Pigs time. It was near then, and they didn't want to come off as too unpatriotic. There were these people who were ultra patriots, and there was even disagreement of like, do we sing the national anthem? Do we sing God Bless America? Do we stand for the pledge? Like the littlest things, and you could see the wide array of opinions about are we Native Americans? Are we Indigenous Americans? Right? And even how they represented their own identity was a big part of this. So chapter 3 was dilemmas, talking about the workshop. So this is really where it starts to get into the NIYC, the National Indian Youth Conference, as its own organization. So at the end of the Chicago conference, the the group that was the most unified was this national the National Indian Youth Council. And they were the more liberal, more progressive, more militant, children of the 60s, Cold War kids type, black and white thinking type activists. They were more unified, like I said, and they really came into their own with this conference. Their more militant nature was explored in this chapter. And he talks about the workshops. He introduces how the workshops were held at a college. It was, you have dozens of Native American youth who are, high school, college age who go. They learn about their painful past and the nature of liberation. And it was liberating, and it was a coming of age experience for many of these. It was a unifying experience for many of these college students. And I think in a lot of ways, it galvanized a force inside of a lot of them, and they were taught how to organize. And we'll get into that more with the next book, which is what the next book, Shreve's book, Red Power, got right here, what this book really goes on about. But getting into the next chapter, chapter 4. So at the end of chapter 3, Kennedy is assassinated, and that really puts the brakes on, puts a pause on a lot of the activities that were going on. There was a big meeting with President Johnson on what the war on poverty would look like because the war on poverty really starts to change things. And Deloria talks about the war of poverty, and ultimately he really gets into and talks about how Vietnam killed the war on poverty. All three authors highlight that. Probably Cobb, to an extent here in this chapter, and it became the central focus in Indian politics. And it was how do we use the war on poverty and use the war on poverty programs that are being created, right? The OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was headed by Sergeant Shriver, who is a in-law to the Kennedys. That office gets kicked off, and that office was instrumental in providing economic support to tribes. But there was a lot of focus on community action programs and a more bottom-up approach. For the first time, probably since John Collier in the 1930s, who was Roosevelt's um, chief Indian affairs guy, they really were starting to listen to Native Americans, or at least it gave the appearance that they were. Um, Meanwhile, as all of this is going on, the National Indian Youth Conference, they come into their own. They come into their own through the winter and spring of 1964. The Fishins, which we'll get into out in Washington State, they were a turning point. So lots of themes about how the Cold War and domestic policies were really starting to positively impact Native Americans. But then we're going to see Vietnam, like it did with many other social programs at home, kind of killed it. Chapter 5, he really gets into that. This is where we talk a little bit more about the OEO. Um, Cobb himself actually critiques the BIA and showing how inept they were. He paints those who called out the BIA in a more positive light. He gives a lot of pages to people who went at lengths to criticize the BIA, but he doesn't go as far to say that they should be dismantled or should have been dismantled. He's in the Deloria camp that they needed significant reorganization, but they shouldn't be canceled. It was interesting here, another Cold War policy about how tribes played the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Office of Economic Opportunity off of each other, right? Kind of like recognizing these are two competing government bureaucracies doing similar things, right? How can we use leverage to ultimately get the best possible outcome for our tribe, which really goes to Deloria's point at the end of his book about, picking your spots and what are the methods you're doing. And that's why he ultimately criticizes the NIYC as being too militant, not picking their spots. Deloria, a little bit of background about him as well. Sorry if I'm all over the place a little bit. He was the president of the NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, as well. And then a quote down there from 124. All right. Um, so this chapter 6 talks about more with Deloria and carving out a niche for Native activism and not pushing for civil rights in the same way activists were. Civil rights activists were, excuse me. Um, and that Cobb goes on to say about how tribal governments were administering programs for their own communities for the first time, and how OEO was more successful than the BIA was. Many Roads, chapter 7. He really goes in on this chapter to talk about the Poor People's March. And this is where I noticed the first significant discrepancy between Cobb and Deloria, whereas Deloria is very much against the Poor People's March. He writes, Indian participation in the Poor People's March seemed to be a surrender to white society, right? He really is like, oh, only 200 Native American, like only 200 Indians went. They were ridiculed, rightfully so. They're traitors, they're Uncle Tomahawks, all these things. And he doesn't Cobb doesn't acknowledge this disagreement specifically. He alludes to it, but he reiterates his thesis by saying that Native Americans who are participating in the Poor People's March are truly, you know, proving the point that, Native American activism is not a monolithic. It didn't start on Alcatraz. It was, um, you know, seen as having broad and many roads, and that's why this chapter is called that. Um, if you look at the Poor People's March as one of many roads, you can see that it wasn't just Alcatraz, it wasn't just these specific big events. There's the small a activism that happened behind the scenes, the logistics he had talked about in earlier chapters. And it expressed that why many natives chose to join the march, it being colorblind. It's just this is a poor people's march. I can't necessarily say who's right or wrong, whether they should or shouldn't have gone. And I'm not gonna try to opine on that, but I do think the disagreement itself is revealing because it reveals the, different methods once again that, you know, you go to the march, you're gonna support rights for all poor people. You're all related and you shouldn't be in your little silos. Cons, right? Native American activism wanted different things and very legitimately than Indians had different goals and ends than African Americans might have. And getting involved with the civil rights movement, might be blurring the lines between the different goals. So I don't know. I think there's valid arguments on both sides. Um, and then we get into our last chapter, freedom, and then the conclusion. It really talks. If chapter 7 was talking about the many roads to get there, chapter 8 and the conclusion really, talks about how the march went, didn't end well. Many were arrested, but they used it as an empowering moment. Conclusion ends with or begins with the death of Clyde Warrior, and then ends with the wide passing of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then the book at the very end, which I think is a really strong way to finish, just to, prove a point about the United States' poor record on oh, that's the wrong one. Uh, the United States poor record on Native American rights and indigenous people and their sovereignty. He writes here, uh, so 143, I believe there's 143 nations voted for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, right? The United States did not. They were one of four. It proclaims the necessity of recognizing the inherent sovereignty of indigenous peoples. 143 nations voted for it. The United States was among the four that did not. I mean, that I think speaks volumes to the thesis of all three of these books, that Native American sovereignty, even as recently as 2007, was still being fought by the United States and by policymakers. And ending with that, I think, was a really strong point. All right, two books down, one to go. Definitely going to go over an hour, so apologies and appreciate it if you are still watching. I hope you have many questions. But we'll do what we can. So last one, Red Power Rising. Um, this one is by Bradley G. Shreve. He very much kind of takes a lot of what Cobb wrote. Cobb, Shreve. Shreve is a lot more focused on specifically the National Indian Youth Council. I definitely said conference a couple times. I might have said Congress once or twice. It's late. We're tired. We're doing our best. National Indian Youth Council. That's the NIYC. All right. Council, conference, same difference. But anyways, milestones, siege at Wounded Knee, shootout at Oglala Sioux Reservation, occupation BIA building. He is also kind of supporting Cobb's view that those are milestones, yes, but those aren't the only ones, right? And he really outlines the National Indian Youth Council's um, involvement in a lot of tribal communities and their approach to activism. His thesis is that they were extremely important, whereas Deloria and Cobb, to maybe a little bit of a lesser extent, kind of just is like they're the little brother organization. They're not always talking to the big guys. They're not making policy. They're like some college kids at these workshops. But Shreve really does a lot to explore the historiography, and he acknowledges Cobb in the introduction, and he says how Cobb was extremely beneficial. He was essential. Daniel Cobb's Native American activism in the Cold War America does more than any other work since Steiner's The New Indians to illustrate the NIYC's importance. He redefines political activism to include those seeking reformative goals. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't focus on them solely, which is what Shreve is set out to do. So I guess it's more Deloria that's against the NIYC, or definitely not as for them. But Cobb, he definitely brings them up, and then Shreve really focuses on them. His writing style and storytelling definitely a little bit more palatable and easier to digest. All right. So I kind of combined a couple chapters here, just bringing up some different quotes and whatnot. I mean, chapter 1, this is really the historical background for Native American activism more broadly. I think he brings up Zikala Saj, Carlos Montezuma, Charles Eastman, and looks at the original assimilation versus independence argument. And I think he does that as well to really highlight who are the forefathers of the movement, right? And I think that was a really helpful thing for him to do, whereas he starts at the beginning. Cobb, I think, kind of is more like the in medias race. Like we're gonna get right into here's the middle of it with Darcy McNichol and the NCAI. So I really appreciated the background information that he provided. And I think that helped ground a lot of what he was saying. And like this is a longer tradition. Um, chapter two really looks at the regional Indian youth councils as a precursor to the NIYC, and how the National Indian Youth Council would not have existed without the regional Indian youth councils. And they were the first project aimed at creating an intertribal student organization. All right. Um, Chapters three and four, Nationalism as a Journey and the founding of the National Indian Youth. This is where we can start to see the disagreements between Deloria and the NIYC more generally. Deloria actually writes that they were generally more liberal and more excitable than the NCAI, and the NIYC inclines to the spectacular short-term project rather than the extended program. I mean, he writes kind of like as the like older guard of like, oh, these kids, they're too quick to emotion and they don't see the long-term goals that we're seeing. Whereas to their point, they were kind of tired of the old guard and they wanted action. They were sick of the wait and see approach that to them didn't get them anywhere. Valid arguments on both sides. And then Chapter 4 begins to highlight the differences between the NIYC and the NCAI. The more militant actions, such as the Americans Before Columbus newspaper, and then talking about like the activist culture of the 1960s, and they were representative of movement politics as a whole, really saying the National Indian Youth Council was very prototypical 60s. And I mean, it supports Cobb's thesis that it reorders, you kind of reorder the historiography and, you're clarifying when things took place and how things took place. And I think that's a big part of what Shreve is intending to do. I gave chapter five its own slide here. Just really, it was a pivotal chapter in terms of describing the fish-in campaign. So what the fish-in campaign was in Washington State, right? There were certain conservation rules set up by white society for when and how you could fish, specifically when. And the only problem with that is it was on, traditionally indigenous lands. And so the NIYC, their first major goal, their first major action was mobilization. They violated Washington state conservation laws. They made activism a part of the greater intertribal fight to preserve native culture on 119. They planned without any outside help. It wasn't they were going to ask the NCAI. They just went and did it. And then Marlon Brando went, which, is really interesting. And some people had mixed feelings on that, right? And he was said to have tried to link Native American rights with civil rights. And they're like, whoa, that's like, you're gonna come, this is great, but like they're separate, right? And they were worried about prejudice. That was another reason I think that wasn't talked about enough by any of the authors about why they didn't want to get lumped into the civil rights movement, because one, there was some prejudice that existed, but two, they didn't know if they were going to be successful if they did. And then a lot of the other reasons I mentioned as well. And then chapter six here, growth of Red Power militancy. We talk about um, I think Shreve does a good job of holding the NIYC's feet to the fire, right? The attending the Poor People's March and how many in the NIYC did want to attend the Poor People's March, which was counter to what Vine Deloria was looking for. He talked about how the fishing campaign, that was really important to them growing as an organization, and it proved that they were successful. And they could, be a force to be reckoned with. Seven and eight kind of go together, the reform and revolt, and then continuity and transformation in the 70s. Native control over Native education. It was an unexpected issue. They thought they were going to do more activism like or at least initially like the fish-ins, but then they had to contend with that. And there was severe fracturing. One of the core disagreements that people within the NIYC faced was, do we want to support more militancy or do we want to support more educational programs? And that's a common theme throughout Native American activism as a whole is what kind of activism do we want to have? Are we going to be more militant? Are we going to try to work with the system, against the system? Are we going to support education? Do we want to be ingrained in society or outside of society? And they're complex questions. And there's no one right answer, right? And every tribe was different in their needs. And then in chapter 8, we learned about Gerald Wilkinson, and he was responsible for rebuilding the NIYC because, as Shreve points out, their militancy and their unpredictability at times was often their downfall. And he goes back to his thesis, which supports the idea that Cobb writes about that it should be capitalized AIM, so American. That's what 192. I'm just gonna read the quote here. Oh, geez. AIM had very different backgrounds from that of the NIYC, right? So they were the American Indian movement, right? And decoupling red power from the American Indian movement and recognizing that those are separate entities, right? And it was interesting hearing about the American Indian movement starting out as, they were, anti-police brutality in the Twin Cities up in Minnesota and, driving people who were intoxicated home and making sure police officers weren't, beating the snot out of Native Americans. And they had gotten to a stretch where there were like 22 straight weeks where a Native American in Minneapolis didn't get arrested, and that was a really big win for them. But they're a different organization, and kind of decoupling, everyone just assumes Red Power, AIM, American Indian Movement, right? Separate. And I think, Shreve and to an extent Cobb go into detail to clarify, right? And by clarifying the different organizations and the different movements and the different goals and the different aims, right? You're able to see, once again, it's not a monolithic culture. It's not a monolithic. Native American activists wanted this, right? No, there's more to it than that. There's a lot more nuance and variation. So we're going to get back to our objectives one last time here. Once again, I appreciate you sticking with me. Those were the three books. That's a synopsis of the three with a little bit of, featuring from our history is the future as, the background for some of these topics in a more modern sense. But so these were our goals, right? And on this first slide, I'm going to go through them one by one and talk about like, okay, well, what did we learn from those three? And this is what I was able to come up with. I think this is, puts these three goals into concise boxes. And certainly this isn't the end of the conversation in a lot of ways. It's just the beginning. But so the first goal to demonstrate an understanding of the variations and nuance that exist within Native American activism during the Cold War. I mean, yeah, the three authors, they make it clear. Once again, no monolithic approach to Native activism. Deloria, he's more the establishment, right? That's not the best word to use, but former head of the NCAI. And he very much critiques the younger NIYC and their more militant methods, saying we got to be reflective, we got to pick our spots, right? Um, Shreve, he explores that divide, right? And he explores it from the perspective of the NIYC, very much focused on like what was the NIYC and how are they involved, right? And gives a lot of the historical background of Native American activism as a whole. And in a lot of ways, kind of surprising that he gave a lot more of that, I think, than Cobb might have. And then Cobb kind of provides insight from the middle, looking at the NIYC versus the NCAI and that fight from the top, and background information on that. All right. Our second objective of three, recognize the link between the quest for Native American sovereignty and Cold War policy. I mean, yeah, All three authors, they explain how the policies by the U.S. government towards indigenous people were part of their developing third world plan. Well, they didn't consult Native Americans about if they wanted to be developed like a third world country and they wanted to be decolonized in the way that the United States was decolonizing other places, right? They did have to walk a tightrope of not trying to sound unpatriotic, but also still advocating for things like the end of the termination policy. Cobb does a really good job of highlighting this. War in Vietnam was another factor, as the Laurier talks about this. And, Cold War policy of they wanted to be the moral superiority of the world, right? While not honoring treaties, while abandoning responsibilities, while, Native Americans were the original colonies within the United States, right? So I think there is a significant link between Native American sovereignty and Cold War policy. And the unfortunate piece of this that I think I come back to from the Native American perspective and the specifically the activist perspective is that a lot of times with their hands tied, right? They couldn't speak out as forcefully, they couldn't act as militantly as they might have wanted to because it was the Cold War, right? Specifically thinking about the Chicago Conference, and not wanting to sound unpatriotic with Bay of Pigs being an antecedent for that. And then our last goal, explain varying approaches and perspectives of the authors, but identify how it applies to the overall historiography. Well, historiography, study of history, right? Like the entire sphere of Native American activism was pushed forward with these three works. And I think that Deloria's work being the oldest, right, reads more like the primary source that these other two books then are kind of answering about. It's very much a manifesto for, Native activism going forward. And it's more broad. It's not just NCAI versus NIYC. It really critiques the United States and their policies towards indigenous peoples from every angle, while also providing a path forward. And what are some solutions to these various things? It reads like it's from an activist while also still acknowledging the history. It encourages reflection and is more of a proper Indian renewal. Where Cobb and Shreve aren't really writing from the activist perspective, their contribution to the historiography is more of a clarification and a reordering, right? Whereas Cobb, he provides insight on the bureaucratic red tape and the logistics, of like how were they able to organize? What were their organizational structures? What were the processes that went into advocating for legislation and getting legislation passed, and bringing issues to, LBJ. He's aiming to reorder history in a more correct way. And he also dispels some red power myths, but he wants to get the 60s back into the 70s. He wants to, clarify some of the events that happened in the late 60s or in the 70s weren't just part of the there's another civil rights movement. It's different, and here's why. And then Shreve, he mainly focuses on the NIYC. His study is more narrow, and he credits Cobb with helping lay a foundation for him, right? Ultimately, I think at the end of the day, these three books, they have way more in common than they have different. They clarify. They often they do disagree with each other at points and they emphasize different things, but there is more that they have um in that they're similar with than they have that they are different with. I think they were great reads. I think that overall, the theme and idea of Native American activism, um, is aided by the reading of these books. And ultimately, I am looking forward to all of your questions and continuing to, dig through these books as I get my historiography, or historiographical paper written. And we'll see what comes from that. But thank you so much for listening and would love to continue this conversation further with many of you in the future. All right. Have a good one.